Hello, I'm Gareth, and it's Tuesday, the 26th of March 2024. We're in our studio here in London. We have voices from Washington, Sao Paulo, and various places on the planet because some of our guests are travelling. We don't know where they are. All we know is that they're on the end of a connection and they're going to be talking to us. So, yeah, we don't call it Somewhere on Earth for nothing, do we? And keeping us very good company today is Angelica Mari. She's that voice I mentioned from Sao Paulo, technology journalist, expert and raconteur for these purposes. Hello, Angelica. How are you?
Hello, I'm great, Gareth. Lovely to be here with you again.
Pleased to hear it. I think the last time we spoke, you were just getting over dengue fever. Has that now washed out of your system?
It is, thankfully.
Thank goodness.
And I've been keeping busy. Now I'm going to start teaching as well. So you have a teaching colleague.
Well, what?
Gareth?
Teaching? You are a woman of many talents. I know you've done a master's recently. I know that you do all kinds of technology journalism, that your interests are wide and varied, that you name your computer hard drives after David Bowie albums. And now you tell the world that you're teaching. What are you teaching?
Yeah, I'm going to be teaching at the postgrad course of future design at PUC Minas, which is one of the best private universities in Brazil. So my course is going to be called Strategic Foresight and Emerging Technology. So I'm really excited.
That's it's about everything we do on this program then, isn't it? Strategic Foresight and Emerging Technology.
Yeah.
So we could pilfer your syllabus.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll just go through all of our scripts of the last year's SOEP, and I'll be fine.
Excellent. Well, this is increasingly turning into an academic seminar. Keep forgetting it's a podcast. How fascinating. All right, lovely. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. Shall we get into the matter in hand then and do a bit of podcasting, Angelica?
Let's go for it.
Here we go. And coming up today, why did the internet go dark across much of West Africa recently? That's the question today in a special edition where we're focusing on one of the undersea fibre optic cables serving West Africa. And we're asking why it failed, leading to widespread disruption. We'll talk about that and the internet infrastructure as a whole. Just how resilient are the pipes that connect the planet? That's all right here on the Somewhere on Earth podcast. All right, so Nigeria has called for the West African region to coordinate to protect shared telecommunications infrastructure. The call follows major disruption to the internet in the last week or so. Services by the African subsea cable operator Seacom went down and internet traffic had to be diverted to other cables. Major internet outages ensued across Ivory Coast, Liberia, Benin, Ghana and Burkina Faso. So all in all, it was a bit of a pickle. So let's try and unpack some of what's been going on. First of all, with Alp Toker of Netblocks. We've had you on the podcast before, Alp, but for those who have not met you already, what is Netblocks? What do you do?
It's good to be back on the show. Netblocks is an internet observatory. We track internet connectivity around the world, and we see when things go down and when things come back up. So this means looking at the various links that connect different countries and different regions and trying to see, when things are restricted, also when governments restrict internet access sometimes, because that's happening increasingly in countries around the world. So Netblocks really tracks all this.
Great, Alp. And welcome back, by the way. Nice to have you back on. Now, your colleague also joins us today, Head of Research, Isik Mater. So, Isik, welcome along to Somewhere on Earth. And what kind of research do you do at Netblocks?
I'm mostly tracking the shutdowns. When I, for example, checking the data and I saw a dip, I immediately start looking for what's going on, because first I see data, then I do research, not the other side, to see what's going on around the world.
So with this recent outage that we're talking about, a very major outage, do you have some dashboard or something where everything flashes in red and maybe it's the middle of the night and you just think, oh my goodness, what's going on? Must investigate.
I was like, what's going on? Why so many countries are down at the same time? So I started researching when I started researching that outage, there wasn't so much data or info about it because I detected very, very early. That morning. So it was impossible to know exactly what's going on. But I predicted it's probably a submarine cable cut, but wasn't sure about the reason.
Sure, and that's something we'll get into in the podcast, is like how you even know and then how gradual or otherwise it was. So we're also going to hear today from Paul Brodsky. He's Senior Analyst at TeleGeography. So you do many things, don't you, at TeleGeography, including, which I find very useful, Paul, that you have a map and you map all the undersea cables around the world, and in fact overland cables. Just if it's a massive, great big fibre optic cable and it carries the internet, you map it. Is that it?
That's basically right. And it's if you just go to submarinecablemap.com, it's a free resource that we keep updated. Yeah, nothing really terrestrial, but if it's a long haul subsea cable, you can take a look at it. You can get a sense of the geography, where it lands, when it came into service, who owns it, etc. It's a really handy public resource that we maintain.
Yeah, I find it incredibly useful as well. And it's fascinating to see just how many of these cables there are. How many have you mapped so far?
Oh, we're up to over 500 right now in active service.
And are these mainly submarine cables, or are quite a few of them overland?
No, these are entirely submarine cables.
All of them? Oh, okay. Yeah. So why not, silly question, why not overland? Is it just, are there other means for transmitting the internet, or that's just not your purview? Are you purely about the submarine ones?
Largely about submarine stuff. I mean, for sort of the simple fact that it's manageable and trackable. I mean, to try to do the same thing with terrestrial networks, it's just an order of magnitude. Those networks, there's so much more of them, and frankly, the information on them is much more difficult to get. And the submarine cable industry is kind of an industry unto itself. And so that's one of the industries that we track.
Sure, right. So what I think we should do in this podcast is lead up to the events that we've seen over West Africa. So rather than jumping straight in with like, hey, what happened? Why don't we just find out, especially from you, Paul, a little bit about the infrastructure as a whole, and then we can go back to the Netblocks people and find out a little bit more about what happened and how they tracked it. So I think many of us just think of the internet as this thing that exists, and then some of us who perhaps give it a little bit more thought almost find it a bit magical and mystical, that somehow a packet of data can get from my device to your device through this amazing collection of cables and links and microwave, you name it. Can you just treat me like a beginner here, Paul? What is the internet then? What's the basic infrastructure? That's the maddest question I've asked for some time.
Well, it's a series of tubes, right? As we learned about 15 years ago from a U.S. senator. No, it's no, you're right. I mean, I think we do. It is this immutable fact in our lives that we can send packets of data, of information from pretty much anywhere on Earth, anywhere else on Earth, around the World Wide Web, right? Hence the hence the term. And really, one of the overriding or defining characteristics of it is its ubiquity. Like literally anywhere on Earth, we have access to the internet. You can connect to anywhere else on Earth that has access to the internet. It's what happens, in between on those long hauls that we keep track of. You're right. We tend to think of it as sort of this mystical, ethereal infrastructure. That it must have something to do with satellites, right? Because satellites are exotic and they're up in the air, and the fact is that it's much more physical in a way. Like it's stuff you can actually hold in your hand. It's not the satellites do play a role, but we estimate anywhere north of 95 to 99% of long haul bandwidth is actually it actually moves via these physical cables that lie across land and under the ocean.
Sure. Okay. And yeah, so the real truth is almost prosaic, it's quite physical. And the cloud is one of the great misnomers in technology because it's just not cloud-like, is it? It is just physical hard infrastructure of, data centers and cables, these huge cables, these undersea cables. If we were to chop one in half and take a continent offline, not really. But what kind of cross section do they have? I'm imagining it's a bit thicker and chunkier than the little tiny bit of fiber that I can see outside my living room window.
Yeah. So the actual, we say there, if you held the whole thing in your hand, it would be about the diameter of a garden hose, and not much more than that. And the actual sort of the business side of it, the actual glass strands that stretch thousands of miles, are about the thickness of a human hair. Sure. And there's not that many of them, these subcables. Some of the older cables were built with only 2 pairs of these fibers. Now, some of the more modern ones are built with 12 or 16 or maybe 24 fiber pairs. That's really cutting edge. But we're still talking, 16, 24 strands of human hair. It's just really small. And they're encased in various layers of, some protection, but not that much. There's some steel belting around it to protect it. There's a sheath of copper for electrical conductivity for the repeaters. Right. So there's a protective layer on the outside of that. And that's it. It just lays on the bottom.
So chunks of the internet held together by really quite fragile infrastructure. And yet, Angelica Mari, technology journalist and academic, Angelica Mari, this is critical infrastructure, isn't it? Of course it is. And yet, in a way, it seems quite fragile from what we've been hearing.
Yeah. I think the discussion around submarine cables and this outage in particular does bring to light the vulnerabilities of our global internet infrastructure. So not only the potential for cable damage due to things like natural disasters, but also accidents or even sabotage. So all of that really does raise questions around about the resilience of digital connections and what is really critical infrastructure. So I would say this situation that we've seen in West Africa is a reminder that a lot of stakeholders need to come together to make sure the infrastructure planning works.
Yeah, and that you have the resilience, you have the backup. And this brings us then to the events of, I believe it was March the 14th. And picture the scene. It's somewhere in Turkey, I'm going to imagine here. And there's a researcher hunched over her laptop, and she's called Isik Mater. We've just met her. And all of a sudden, she gets a notification or something turns red on her screen and she says, this is interesting, and immediately WhatsApps her colleague Alp and says, something's going on here. Pick up the story for us, Isik.
That's exactly what happened, actually.
It's as if I was there.
Hey, what's going on there? Yeah, because it was more than 10 countries at the moment. It was the early stage of the outage. Then we have a couple of countries went down. Then after 3 hours, other set of countries went down as well. So it's 2 stages together.
2 stages? That's interesting. How did that go in 2 stages then? Why didn't it all just go down at the same? Because I thought maybe if you had some damage to an undersea cable, then it's all or nothing. It's how come it happened? Yes, as you say, in staged kind of way. Because
some countries have more than one cable connected. For example, Djibouti has 11 subsea cables landing. For example, Togo has only one. Liberia has only one. So first, maybe main one went down, and then AA1 went down. So it's a domino effect.
What would that have felt like to internet users then? Would it have been instantaneous, or would they have seen a gradual degradation of their broadband?
Some felt it is instant, and others are I have a slow internet connection. What's going on? They mention MTN, they mention other ISPs and asking what's going on because they have very, very slow connection at that moment.
And Alp, when all this was going on, then traffic was diverted, I suppose, due to the wonderful way the internet was designed in the first place, emerging from a defense network by DARPANET. The whole idea of it was that it was meant to be resilient and automatically divert packets of data if something happened. So did that happen in this case? And to what extent did that happen?
Right. So the morning of the 14th was fascinating in terms of routing and network topology, because like Isik said, it didn't just happen in one go, but you can actually trace how networks tried to recover and restore themselves, and also how that impacted other networks that were actually doing probably okay, but then suddenly had to take on the additional load from these disconnected undersea networks. So on that morning, we saw initially, obviously, the set of countries involved with the Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, and West Africa, but we also saw, very tellingly, disconnections in South Africa. So suddenly you're saying, okay, this isn't localized. You're seeing things at two ends of the continent. And that is the key point at which you can start to attribute the incident to a subsea cable, because you know that things are going wrong at both ends of that cable. So it's really a matter of tracking that stage by stage progression. But, we saw some countries recover in a matter of minutes. So they just switched over to connectivity that they had. They're fortunate. They have landing points that, countries that are by the sea that aren't landlocked are a lot more fortunate in this respect, because they probably have some other cables coming in. But those landlocked countries often, rely on that connectivity from outside, from another seaside country.
Paul, it's very interesting to hear Alp say that he managed to get quite an instant signature, as it were, as to what kind of outage this might be and what cable was involved. And of course, it was tracked down to this particular CCOM cable. So can I infer then that it is a piece of fibre that connects South Africa and landing stations in West Africa? Can you give me the geography of this cable, if you like?
Well, to be clear, it was not the CCOM cable that was damaged off the west coast of Africa.
Was it not? Which one was then?
Yeah, so sorry. So there's a bit of history here. So about a month ago, 3 cables were damaged in the southern Red Sea, and CCOM was one of those. CCOM runs from South Africa up the east coast of Africa, around Somalia and into the Red Sea. And there was an incident in the southern Red Sea involving the Houthis and all those activities there that took out 3 subcables in the southern Red Sea, including CCOM, which serves the east coast of Africa. The incident that happened a couple of weeks ago off the west coast of Africa involved 4 different submarine cables: SAT-3, Main 1, the ACE cable, and WAX. Now, CCOM, the company, CCOM, the network operator, has capacity on more than just one submarine cable, which is very common. They have capacity on their own cable, which runs up the east coast of Africa. They also have capacity on some of the west coast cables as well. Presumably, at least one of them that was damaged. So the CCOM network certainly would have experienced some outages on the west coast as well. But just to be clear, the cable itself, named CCOM, is on the East Coast.
All right, thanks. That's useful clarification there. So,
yeah,
but there is no, please don't. Sorry, I'm sorry for getting that wrong more than anything, and for confusing the listeners potentially. So, but then nonetheless, there is kind of this connectivity linking, obviously going all the way down. Well, you mentioned CCOM, East Coast, and in the subscription extra version, I want to talk about what's going on in the Red Sea. So hold that thought, Paul, because I do want to come back to that in the podcast extra. But so on the West Coast, just help me and the listeners out here then. Can you pin down, as it were, or can you tell me what we know about that link, as it were, and where it was severed? And I'm going to ask the Netblocks guys about what they think happened. You've probably got your own theory, Paul, but for now, let's just sort out the geography.
Yeah. So of the 4 cables that were damaged off the west coast of Africa, 3 of them extend all the way down to South Africa from Europe. And those are the SAT-3, ACE, and WAX cables. The 4th cable is Main 1, and that extends from Europe as far down as Nigeria. And all 4 of those have been damaged. So since countries south of Nigeria, like South Africa, et cetera, they rely to a certain degree on those West Coast cables connecting to Europe. when you take out 3 of the 4 cables that connect South Africa to Europe, there's going to be, congestion on the 4th, and some customers are going to be impacted. And network operators then are kind of left scrambling to try to reroute some of their traffic onto cables that have not been damaged.
And as you were saying that, I've been following it on your submarinecablemap.com map. It's incredibly useful. So, Angelica, let's come to you then, and what you make of all this, just how serious this is, and there's a digital inclusion story here, or digital exclusion when things go wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is really important to sort of recognize all of this as part of a larger narrative on digital inclusivity and bridging the digital divide. I think improving or fixing the submarine cable network does a lot more than just expanding internet capacity. I think it opens up avenues for economic growth, for educational opportunities. It can help people develop businesses. It can attract investments and advance African countries overall. So it is really important to talk about that, because subsea cables are far from the far from the mind, right?
Yeah, and not particularly glamorous.
Yeah.
No, sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, so we've got everybody on tenterhooks here, just wondering, but what happened? And what do we know about what happened? So, Isik, let's come back to you. What do you think, or maybe what do you know happened?
We'll be back after a quick break.
AI is changing the game of business. Will you be on the winning team? I'm Jordan Wilson, the host of the Everyday AI podcast, and your coach to help you learn the X's and O's of AI. Artificial intelligence isn't just a new player in the game, it's a new sport altogether. So if you don't quickly put AI into play, your competitors will run up the score. I've spent my whole life building winning teams, from coaching basketball to working with big players like Nike and Jordan Brand. My next move? Helping you win with Everyday AI. Listen wherever you get your podcasts or on everydayaipodcast.com. Let's tap into AI together and put points on the board.
Well, according to main one's statement, they said preliminary findings and further investigations revealed that the fault occurred most probably due to environmental factors such as landslides and earthquakes that resulted in a cut on our submarine cable system in Atlantic Ocean offshore Ivory Coast, they say. I think it makes sense because the first country went down was Liberia, and Ghana followed it, so it's probably begin with the ACE cable or maybe wax.
Yeah. Well, Paul, would you agree with that then from what you've read of this situation?
That sounds entirely reasonable. There's a history of submarine landslides off the west coast of Africa taking out cables, so I find this entirely credible theory, yeah.
And Alp, then, these cables, they presumably, they are in contact with the sea floor. So, of course, you have any kind of slip, some seismic issue down there. You can imagine what it's going to do to a pretty fragile piece of cable. I was just thinking about, are there other possibilities here, Alp? In terms of, some people think it might have been to do with a ship's anchor scraping along near one of the landing sites, possibly. Others have said sabotage. It seems as if the consensus is, these kind of natural events. But what else potentially could it be? Or, with other outages, how can they come about?
So when an internet disruption is tracked, you start to go through a checklist of what kind of disruption it might be. So we know already from that pattern that this is likely related to subsea cables, submarine cables, but that doesn't mean it's actually the cable that is cut. So the first thing that we went through in terms of a checklist that morning were, could it be a land-based disruption to the landing point? So this is a big kind of data center where things are really multiplexed and then reconnected. So this is where, pulses of light are turned into internet or other protocol layer messages. And, you want to check, is this happening on land, close to sea, but not actually at sea? Is it happening maybe between countries, even from a landing point country which doesn't really use that connectivity to a country which distributes it further? Or could it be something else? And also, if you take for given that this is a subsea cable disruption, is it happening near the coastal shelf? So that is where a dragging a ship's anchor might actually disrupt that cable, or is it happening in deep sea? In which case, an anchor won't do it. Divers probably won't get there. A deep sea submarine might, but that's entering kind of conspiracy theory land. And then you just go through that checklist and see what the data can correlate and tell you about that disruption. And especially in the context of that fear of sabotage by the Houthis in the Red Sea, that was the context in which it's happened. So there was a lot of almost kind of fear and doubt and misinformation circulating that, oh, look, the Houthis have gone and done it. So it's a matter of dispelling that kind of disinformation as well.
And I'm aware Angelica's on the call here as well. So are there kind of burning questions that you had, Angelica, even like wearing your journalistic hat? You have 3 top experts here as well. So what have I missed out here?
Yeah, I was curious to find out what happened in terms of traffic rerouting, Alp. So can you tell us what actually happened after that major event? Because what we know is that at least 9 countries lost connection to the internet. So tell us what happened then.
Right. So we saw overall impact to, I think, over a dozen countries, and there may be more knock-on impacts. But we also saw that some countries had a very rapid recovery, almost immeasurable, almost very short, so difficult to measure. They just switched back over to another connection. And in fact, we were quite careful. And in the initial report, I think we didn't actually mention the ones that had brief disruptions because we wanted to check those further. But the key thing is that other countries have had this longer disruption that has lasted maybe 2 days before starting to recover. And we've seen that Côte d'Ivoire has had this kind of extended disruption without any real sign of recovery. So in an ideal case, a perfect network would actually reroute with almost no observable disruption. And I don't know, I think Ishik might even remember some of the countries that had kind of blips, but that actually rapidly came back on.
Yeah, it says quite a lot about individual nation states' infrastructure in terms of just how well it resumes normality after you've had a big disruption like this. Paul, just really quickly, because we're running out of time here, but can you just quickly give the listener a feel for how close to the coast these cables are? We've heard from out there, he did say, obviously, close to the landing stations, this is where you could get the damage from ships, anchors and so on. And looking at your map, and I've got it right here in front of me, and I can see all these lines following the coast of both sides of Africa, but we're talking about West Africa here. Looking at your map, it's almost as if these cables are hugging the coast, they're touching the coastline. But in reality, how far out to sea are they?
To be clear, the submarinecablemap.com, the where they show where the cables are, it's really a schematic.
Yeah, sure.
So we don't represent that these are the actual locations.
Yeah, I guess so. I knew it was schematic. But do you know just offhand, are they like 100 meters out or 100 kilometers out, or it varies? Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the issues is that in order to land the cable, to actually get it, on shore, obviously there needs to be a branch that runs, through shallow and, ever more shallow water, obviously, because you're getting on land eventually. The issue is how far off is the main trunk. Yeah. And one of the issues with the older cables is that they tend to be fairly close to land. To tell you the truth, I don't know how close they actually are.
Fair enough.
But one of the one cable that is standing, that is still running, and is is bailing out a lot of this traffic now, is the newer Equiano cable, which was financed in large part by Google, and they designed that cable intentionally to be as far off of land as possible for those very reasons. The designers of the cable were well aware of all of the problems that the west coast of Africa presents. And the closer to shore you are, the more issues there are with what's called turbidity and submarine geology problems. So they built that cable much further west into the ocean and is expected to be much more stable.
Sure.
But I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to
No,
you.
exactly. And I wasn't expecting you to say, oh, they're exactly this much. It's just to get a general kind of idea. Yeah. But rest assured, I guessed this was a schematic, that you hadn't actually done a kind of geographically precise plot. It's. In fact, I was going to put it to you earlier in the program that it reminds me of the metro map that many cities have. It's that kind of style. Okay, right. Now, we need to wrap it up for this part of the podcast, but I think listeners will want to know, Isik, you can finish us off here, just how close to normal things are. We've heard that some disruption has carried on in some of these countries, others are back on. If you could quantify it briefly, are we 50%, 60, 95% back to normal in West Africa as we sit here recording this on Tuesday, the 26th of March?
Well, according to Main One's latest statement, they say they will repair it in 8 weeks. I think they are sending a vessel at the moment. But from my table, it looks like most of the countries, looks fine. I mean, they recovered almost, most of them. But we have interestingly very sporadic outages with some countries. They keep going and coming and going, like not stable connections at the moment.
Sure. And it's sad to say that it's probably only a matter of time before something similar happens again. And I have Angelica's calls ringing in my ears here just for a greater consensus, an international conversation about the resilience for these particular nodes, as it were. I know they're not technically nodes anyway, but these elements of the internet infrastructure, let's put it that way. I think we're going to wrap it up here for this section of the podcast. I think we've given it a good airing for those who will not get to listen to the subscription version. So I think we've served you, dear listeners, very well. But for those who fancy a little bit more, that is on its way in the podcast extra. But not before I've just said thank you, an interim thank you, before they hang on the line and talk to us further, to Paul Brodsky and also Isik Mater and Alp Toker. The last two names are with Netblocks, and Paul, of course, you're with TeleGeography. Angelica Mari, thanks as ever as well. And to the crew here at Lanson's Team Fana for making it all sound absolutely rather marvellous today, Keziah Wenham Kenyon. The production manager is Liz Tuohy. The producer is Ania Lichtarowicz. Is that all the names? That was quite a long credit list, wasn't it? And me, Gareth, someone or other, whatever. Here we go. That's the show. Thanks for listening, folks, and we'll see you next time.